If we
Please
continue,
take me as your
we
worker,
will
ma'am.
die.
I'm strong.
Then we
Begged
die
the
with
giant
honor.
Viking to the
I
rich
will not
widow.
yield this ship.
At the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned into jagged cliffs, a lone figure strode with a purpose that made the earth itself seem to tremble. He was tall, towering, even muscles coiled beneath furs worn from battles that had long passed. His hair, the color of midnight, was tied back in a rough braid, and his eyes were as pale and distant as frozen lakes. Eirik, the giant Viking, had wandered many lands, searching for something he could not name. Honor had betrayed him, and clans had turned away when he refused bloodshed that he could not justify. Now he sought a new path, one not defined by fear, revenge, or endless war. His steps brought him to the gates of a vast estate perched atop cliffs, where the wind howled through its stone walls, and smoke rose from chimneys like the estate itself was breathing. Lady Selene, the widow of the north, stood at the balcony above the gate. Her eyes, sharp as winter ice, studied the approaching figure with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Her husband had died years ago, leaving her with vast lands and an estate full of servants, yet her heart had remained untouched by warmth. Whispers of a lingering family curse had traveled far, making strangers wary of even passing near her gates. And yet here was a man, imposing and unafraid, stepping boldly into the snow. Eirik stopped before the gates and bowed low, his voice steady, yet filled with a quiet urgency. "Please take me as your worker, ma'am. I am strong and I will serve you loyally." Selene's eyebrows rose. Most men would have cowered or fled at the sight of her estate, her reputation, or the harsh northern winters. But this man did not tremble. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of honor, of pain, and perhaps hope, that made her curious. "You claim strength," she said, her voice cold, precise. "But strength alone does not earn trust. Why should I allow a stranger to walk these halls?" Eirik's jaw tightened. "Because, Lady Selene, I seek not only work but purpose. I wish to protect what you hold dear. I will labor, guard, and endure whatever you command. Let me prove myself. Only allow me that chance." Selene considered him in silence. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and she noticed the scars along his forearms, the faint lines of battle etched across his skin. Perhaps he was telling the truth. Perhaps he was a man burdened by honor and mistakes, and perhaps she longed for someone strong enough to withstand the shadows that clung to her home. "Very well," she said finally, "you may enter. But know this estate does not forgive foolishness, nor does it welcome the weak." Eirik nodded once, low and deliberate, and followed the pathway into the estate. Snow crunched under his boots, echoing through the empty courtyards. Servants glanced at him with awe and unease. None had seen a man of his size and presence before. And when he entered the main hall, the firelight reflected in his pale eyes, hinting at a soul both haunted and noble. Selene led him to the quarters he would occupy, a modest room near the stables. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather, the faintest scent of lavender from the widow herself lingering in the corners. Eirik set down his belongings carefully, then turned to face her, as if waiting for further orders. "You will start at dawn," she said. "You will learn the routines of this estate, observe, and perhaps you will earn more than a place among the workers." Eirik bowed. "Thank you, Lady Selene. I will not disappoint you." That night the estate was quiet, yet not entirely at peace. Shadows moved across the walls, cast by candlelight, and the wind whispered secrets no one wished to hear. Selene walked the halls alone, sensing a presence in the dark that she could not name. She paused outside the balcony doors and stared into the night. Something had changed with Eirik's arrival, an energy that felt both protective and unsettling. Days passed, and Eirik's presence became a rhythm within the estate. He worked tirelessly, lifting fallen timber, repairing fences, and tending to the cold horses in the stables. Selene watched him from afar, noting the care with which he handled each task. He was not merely strong, he was careful, deliberate, patient. There was a quiet dignity in the way he moved, and she could not deny the faint pull she felt whenever their paths crossed. One evening, a storm rose over the cliffs, fierce and sudden. Lightning split the sky, and the wind carried an eerie howl. Selene had ventured out to inspect damage from the first gusts when she heard a cry low and unnatural, coming from the edge of the cliffs. Her heart seized. Eirik was already moving before she could call him. He ran to the sound, fists ready, eyes narrowed. Selene followed cautiously, the snow slick beneath her boots. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure, moving with impossible speed, circling the cliff edge where the rocks met the dark waters below. It was not fully human nor fully beast, and it vanished whenever the lightning lit the night. Eirik stepped forward without hesitation. "Stay back," he called. His voice was a hammer in the wind, steady and commanding. Selene's pulse raced, but she did not move. She watched as Eirik lunged, and though the shadow eluded him, it faltered, leaving behind a faint mark on her wrist, a dark, pulsing smear that burned cold to the touch. She gasped and tried to pull back, but the mark seemed to cling to her skin as if it had a will of its own. Eirik turned to her immediately. His eyes softened, concern etched across his rugged features. "Lady Selene, are you hurt?" I think it touched me," she stammered, staring at the mark that throbbed with an unearthly rhythm. What is this?" Eirik knelt to examine it, his large hands gentle despite their strength. "It is not ordinary," he said. "Your family, the whispers were true. There is a curse upon you." Selene felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the wind. "A curse? But my husband, he died long ago." "I thought it was merely tragedy, not magic." "Curses have patience," Eirik said quietly. "They wait for the right moment, the right weakness. But do not fear. I will stay by your side. I will help you face this." For the first time, Selene felt something she had not known in years, hope. Yet alongside it, a faint, creeping fear. The curse had touched her, and with it came the realization that her life and heart were no longer entirely her own. The storm passed, leaving snow-covered silence in its wake. Eirik stayed with her until the fire in the hall burned low and she finally asked, Why are you here really? You could have gone anywhere." Eirik looked into the flames, then back at her, and for a moment the giant Viking seemed smaller, human in his uncertainty. "Because I do not belong in the lands I have known. I have wandered far, and everywhere I went I left shadows behind. Perhaps here I can find purpose. Perhaps here I can protect rather than destroy." Selene did not know what to say. Words felt fragile against the weight of his presence, the darkness that hovered just beyond the firelight, and the unknown that had already begun to stir in her veins. She only nodded and, for the first time, allowed herself to feel less alone. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the cliffs, carrying the echoes of the storm. And in the distance, the shadow that had marked her wrist lingered, unseen, waiting for the moment to strike again. Eirik stood at the balcony, watching the horizon, silent and vigilant. Selene, across the hall, touched the mark on her wrist and whispered a name only she knew, the name of the past she could not yet let go. Their fates were intertwined now, though neither fully understood how. One thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And in that quiet tension, something fragile and undeniable began to grow between them. An unspoken bond, forged in storm and shadow, one that promised protection, danger, and a strange, fierce longing neither could yet name. The night deepened. Snow fell like tiny stars, blanketing the estate, and somewhere beyond the cliffs in the darkness, a shadow watched, patient and unyielding. The morning sun rose weakly over the northern cliffs, casting a pale light across Lady Selene's estate. Snow crunched underfoot as Eirik moved through the courtyard, his broad shoulders rigid but calm. Even after the storm, the estate bore scars: broken fences, damaged roof tiles, and the faint remnants of frost-covered footprints where the shadow had danced. The servants whispered behind closed doors, casting anxious glances at the giant Viking who now moved among them like a living force of nature. Selene watched him from the balcony, arms crossed, her breath fogging in the cold air. She felt a pull she could not name, a mix of curiosity, caution, and something deeper, something that stirred her heart despite the layers of ice she had built around it. The mark on her wrist had faded to a dull warmth, but she could still feel it, a constant reminder that her life was no longer entirely her own. Eirik worked in silence, lifting heavy beams and repairing the damage left by the storm. His movements were precise, strong, yet careful, almost reverent in the way he handled each task. It was not just muscle he offered, it was attention, care, and patience. The estate seemed to breathe easier with him in it, as if his presence was pushing back against the lingering shadows. Selene descended the stairs, her boots crunching on the frost. She approached him, careful not to startle him. "The stables are cold," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "Make sure the horses are warm. They have suffered through the storm too." Eirik nodded. "I will see to them," he replied, his voice low like distant thunder. He paused for a moment, then added, "Lady Selene, may I ask you something?" She inclined her head. "You may. Why do you endure this estate alone?" His gaze was steady, searching, as if he were probing not only the walls of her home but the walls around her heart. Selene hesitated. Few had dared to ask, and none had asked with such gentle strength. I have my reasons," she said finally. "My husband is gone. The estate demands attention, and some pains are mine to bear alone." Eirik looked at her, the quiet empathy in his eyes almost overwhelming. "Not all pains must be carried alone," he said softly. "If I am here, allow me to share the burden. Let me protect you, not just the estate but you." Selene's breath caught. The offer was simple, almost naive, yet filled with the weight of sincerity. She wanted to reject it, to maintain control over her life, her emotions, and her heart. But the truth was, she had been lonely for far too long, and the idea of strength standing beside her, not over her, stirred something unexpected. Days turned into weeks, and Eirik became part of the estate's rhythm. He worked alongside the servants, repaired broken walls, and tended to the horses, yet always with an awareness that the estate and its lady were more than they seemed. Selene watched him in secret at times, noting the quiet dignity in his movements, the patience in his eyes, and the way he seemed to sense danger even in moments of calm. One evening, as the sun dipped below the cliffs, Selene found herself walking along the forest path near the edge of the estate. Eirik followed silently, as he often did, a shadow of reassurance behind her steps. The snow beneath their boots was soft, muffling their movements, and the wind carried a faint whisper that made the trees shiver. "Eirik," Selene began, unsure of why she spoke the words aloud, "do you ever fear what lies ahead?" Eirik stopped and turned to her, his pale eyes reflecting the fading light. "Fear is a part of living," he said quietly. "But I have learned that fear is only dangerous when it is faced alone. When you share it, it becomes a guide, not a chain." Selene shivered, partly from the cold, partly from the strange warmth his words brought. She glanced at him, noticing for the first time the small scars along his forearms, the faint lines that hinted at past battles, and the quiet sorrow in his expression. He was a man who carried shadows, yet he stood before her with unwavering strength. Their walk was interrupted by a distant cry, a sound carried by the wind, faint yet chilling. The trees around them seemed to hold their breath. Eirik stiffened instantly, moving to stand between Selene and the forest. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice low and commanding. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, dark, and moving with an unnatural grace. Selene recognized the shape from the storm night, the shadow creature that had marked her wrist. It lingered at the forest's edge, watching them with eyes that seemed to glow with cold intelligence. Eirik stepped forward, fists clenched, and his voice echoed through the trees. Leave her be, go back to where you came from. The shadow did not respond. It moved closer, and Selene felt a wave of fear she had not felt in years. Her heartbeat raced, yet she did not falter. She looked at Eirik, whose presence was a steady anchor, and for the first time she felt the courage to face the unknown. But before he could act, the shadow recoiled and vanished into the forest, leaving only the rustle of branches and the faintest trace of cold darkness in its wake. Selene exhaled, trembling, and looked down at her wrist. The mark was faint, yet it still pulsed like a heartbeat. Eirik knelt beside her, his hand hovering above the mark without touching it. "It is not gone," he said quietly. "The curse waits, it watches, but I will not leave your side, I swear it." Selene swallowed hard. The weight of his words and the sincerity behind them pressed against her chest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she was not alone, where someone stood beside her against shadows both seen and unseen. That night, as the estate lay in silence, Selene could not sleep. She wandered the halls, her fingers brushing the walls, tracing the cold stone that had always seemed so permanent. And she found herself thinking of Eirik, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he carried his past without letting it crush him. In the quiet of the library, she whispered almost to herself, "Perhaps I am not as alone as I believed." Outside, the northern wind howled through the cliffs, carrying faint whispers that seemed to echo from the past. And somewhere in the shadows, the creature waited, patient and persistent, as if it knew that the moment of awakening was drawing near. Over the following days, Eirik began to reveal fragments of his past. He told Selene about the clan that had turned against him, about the choice that had branded him dishonorable, and about the nights he had spent wandering, searching for a place where he could do no harm yet still be of use. His words were simple, but each carried a weight that pressed against Selene's heart. "You were exiled," Selene said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "For refusing to kill," Eirik nodded, looking down at his hands. "I could not bring myself to take a life for pride or vengeance. The clan saw it as weakness, but I cannot regret it. I only regret the pain I have carried since then." Selene's chest tightened. She understood the burden of choices made long ago, of honor and pride entwined with guilt and loss. And in that understanding, a fragile connection began to grow, two souls, wounded yet determined, finding recognition in each other. But the curse was never far. Selene felt it in the way shadows lingered too long, in the chill that seeped into the walls at night, and in the faint, pulsing warmth of her wrist. She knew that the creature's return was inevitable, and that each day of peace was borrowed, fragile and fleeting. One evening, as they stood near the cliff edge watching the sun dip below the horizon, Selene turned to Eirik. "Do you think I can survive this curse?" Eirik's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "You have survived more than most," he said, "and you will not face it alone. We will find a way together." For a long moment they stood in silence, the wind whipping around them, the sea below crashing against the rocks. And in that silence, a truth settled between them. Their fates were bound not by obligation but by something deeper, something neither had yet named. Yet the shadow lingered in the forest beyond the cliffs, unseen but always present, watching, waiting, patient. And the pulse on Selene's wrist quickened, a reminder that the darkness was far from finished. Eirik tightened his grip on the railing, his jaw set. "The next time it comes," he said quietly, "I will not allow it to escape." Selene nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and courage. "And I will face it with you." The sun vanished behind the horizon, leaving only twilight and the first flickers of stars. Snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the estate in quiet white. But beneath that quiet, tension simmered. Secrets had been shared, bonds had been formed, and the shadows were beginning to stir more insistently. And in the depths of the forest, eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, patient and unyielding. The curse was awakening. The wind had grown sharper in the north, carrying snowflakes that stung the skin like tiny shards of glass. Lady Selene stood at the balcony, wrapped in a thick cloak, staring out at the jagged cliffs and the endless sea beyond. Her thoughts were tangled in the days since Eirik had arrived, and in the shadows that had begun to stir once more. Every moment with him had become a mixture of calm and tension. His presence was both a shield and a spark she could not ignore. Eirik moved through the courtyard, carrying timber from the broken fence near the stables. He worked with quiet precision, muscles straining under the load, yet there was a rhythm to his movements that spoke of patience as well as strength. Selene watched him from above, feeling the strange pull in her chest that she could not name. He was more than a protector. He was a force that reminded her of life beyond solitude, yet one she feared she could not fully trust, not because of him, but because of the shadows that haunted her estate. The snow began to fall heavier, blanketing the land in white silence. Inside the estate, the fire burned bright, yet even its warmth could not chase away the unease Selene felt. She walked through the hallways, her fingers brushing the cold stone walls, and paused outside Eirik's room. He was sharpening a blade by candlelight, the glow illuminating his chiseled features and the pale lines of fatigue etched across his face. She hesitated, then spoke. "Eirik." He looked up immediately, the blade pausing in his hands. "Lady Selene." I need to know more about you," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Your past, your burdens, why you truly wander here." Eirik set the blade down and sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "My past is heavy," he admitted. "I was once part of a clan that demanded blood and obedience. I refused. I could not kill for pride, for honor that was not mine to take. They cast me out. Since then I have wandered, never staying, never belonging. I have seen darkness and carried guilt, but I do not wish to harm again. I only wish to protect, to serve, to find a purpose that is mine." Selene felt a pang of empathy. She had carried her own burdens, locked away in the cold stone halls of her estate. "And yet you chose this place. Why?" "Because I sensed something in you," Eirik said, his gaze steady. "A strength I do not see often, and a vulnerability you do not let anyone near. I thought perhaps here I could find purpose and perhaps I could help." Selene's heart stirred. His words were simple, but the weight behind them pressed against her chest. She wanted to reject them, to remain untouchable, yet the truth was undeniable. She had never felt this connection with anyone before. The moment was broken by a sudden chill. The wind outside intensified, carrying an unnatural cold that seeped through the walls. Selene instinctively looked at her wrist. The faint mark was glowing again, pulsing with a rhythm that made her pulse quicken. Eirik noticed immediately. "It has returned," he said quietly. "The curse, it grows stronger." Selene felt a shiver run through her. "What does it want?" "I do not know," Eirik admitted, his jaw set, "but I will not let it take you." Together they stepped outside, following the path toward the cliffs. The snow crunched underfoot, but the estate behind them seemed almost forgotten in the vast whiteness. And then they saw it, the shadow. Dark, formless, moving with impossible speed along the cliffs, watching them with glowing eyes. Eirik moved in front of Selene, his stance protective yet tense. "Stay behind me," he commanded. The shadow circled them, never fully solid, never fully human. It seemed to test, to wait, to see who would break first. Selene felt fear rise in her chest, yet she did not falter. She glanced at Eirik, whose presence was a steady anchor, and found courage in his strength. "Why does it come?" she asked quietly. "Because it senses weakness," Eirik replied. "It feeds on fear, on doubt, on the heart that trembles." Selene clenched her fists. "Then it will find none of that in me." Eirik's eyes softened, a flicker of pride and something deeper shining through. "You are stronger than you believe," he said, "stronger than the curse knows." The shadow lunged suddenly, faster than the eye could follow. Eirik moved instinctively, intercepting it with his strength and skill. The force of the encounter sent them both stumbling, snow swirling around them like a storm made of shadows and wind. Selene fought to keep her balance, her pulse racing, her heart hammering not only from fear but from the closeness of Eirik, from the raw energy that surrounded him. The shadow recoiled and vanished into the forest, leaving only silence and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Eirik turned to Selene, his breathing steady despite the exertion. "It will not stop," he said simply. "We must be ready always." Selene's fingers brushed the faint mark on her wrist, the pulsing warmth reminding her of the danger that still lingered. "And if we fail?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. Eirik's hand hovered near hers, not touching, yet offering comfort. "Then we face it together," he said. "I will not let it take you, Lady Selene. Not now, not ever." For a moment the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them, the cold wind, the swirling snow, the cliffs below, and the bond forming in the space between them. Selene felt a strange warmth despite the cold, a feeling of safety and trust she had not known in years. In the days that followed, their bond deepened. Eirik trained her in ways to protect herself, teaching her to sense danger, to move with caution, and to trust her instincts. Selene found herself drawn to him in ways she could not explain, admiration, gratitude, and something far more tender that she had never allowed herself to feel. One evening, as the firelight flickered in the great hall, Selene confessed her fears. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of the curse of the shadows, of losing myself in this darkness." Eirik knelt beside her chair, placing a hand gently on hers. "Fear is natural," he said, "but you are not alone. Whatever comes, we will face it together." The words settled into her chest like a warm flame, melting the ice she had built around her heart. She looked into his eyes and saw not only strength but understanding, patience, and a quiet longing that mirrored her own. But the shadow's threat was far from over. One night as they walked along the cliffs after a day of training and repairs, the wind shifted, carrying a sound that made Selene's blood run cold. A whispering voice, low and distant, speaking words she could not understand yet felt in her bones. Eirik stiffened. "It is near," he said, scanning the forest below. "Stay close to me." The snow around them began to swirl violently, forming shapes that seemed almost human, almost alive. Selene's heart raced, yet she did not retreat. She had learned in these weeks that fear could be faced, that courage was not the absence of it but the choice to stand despite it. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced, forming a figure that reached toward Selene. The air grew colder, heavier, and the mark on her wrist flared with a bright pulse that burned like fire beneath her skin. Eirik moved forward without hesitation, his hand steady, his voice commanding. "I will not let you touch her." The shadow recoiled, but the intensity of the encounter left both of them shaken. Selene's breath came in ragged gasps, her hands pressed to her wrist. It will not stop," she whispered. "No," Eirik said, his voice low and determined. "But neither will we. We are stronger together than it could ever know." For a long moment they stood on the cliff edge, snow swirling around them, hearts pounding, and the bond between them strengthened by fear, trust, and a spark neither could yet name. The night deepened, stars twinkling faintly through the clouds, and somewhere in the forest the shadow lingered, watching and waiting, patient and unyielding. The curse was growing, and the trials ahead would test not only their strength but the depth of their connection. Yet in that cold, snow-laden night, Selene felt something she had not known in years: hope. And beside her, Eirik's presence was a reminder that even in darkness, fire could burn. The northern cliffs were silent beneath a heavy blanket of snow, broken only by the faint crash of waves against jagged rocks below. Lady Selene stood at the edge of the estate, her cloak wrapped tightly around her, staring into the horizon where the wind tore at the frozen sea. The past weeks had tested her in ways she could never have imagined. The shadow that had marked her wrist pulsed faintly beneath her skin, a reminder that the curse was growing stronger with each passing day. Eirik approached silently, his broad frame cutting a path through the snow. His eyes, pale as ice, held concern and determination. "The curse, it will not wait much longer," he said softly, his voice carrying across the frozen air. "We must go to the temple of your ancestors. That is where the final test lies." Selene nodded, her breath visible in the frigid air. She had feared this moment, yet a strange courage coursed through her veins. With Eirik by her side, she felt the strength to face whatever awaited them. Together, they descended from the cliffs, following a narrow, winding path into the forest beyond. The trees loomed tall, skeletal against the gray sky, their branches weighed down by frost. Every sound, every snap of a twig, every distant gust of wind set Selene's nerves on edge. Yet with Eirik beside her, she felt anchored. He moved with a careful grace, alert to every movement, every shadow. She watched him, noticing the small signs of tension in his posture, the faint lines of worry around his eyes. Despite his strength, she knew he carried his own burdens, memories of a past he could not forget, guilt he could not shake. After hours of travel, they reached the ruins of an ancient temple, half buried in snow and ice. The stone walls were carved with runes that glowed faintly, pulsing like the heartbeat of the land itself. Selene felt the weight of history pressing down on her, the energy of generations past flowing through the frost-laden stones. "This is it," Eirik said, his voice low. "Inside, you will confront the spirits of your ancestors, the shadows of the curse. But you are not alone. I am here always." Selene took a deep breath and stepped forward. The air inside the temple was thick and cold, carrying whispers that seemed to rise from the very stones. The shadows swirled around her, taking shapes she could barely comprehend. Faces of long-dead relatives, warriors who had once fought for honor, and the faint traces of the curse that had haunted her family for generations. Eirik moved to stand beside her, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was small but grounding, a reminder that she was not facing this alone. "Trust yourself," he whispered. "Trust us." The shadows coalesced into a figure more solid than ever before. It moved with purpose, circling Selene and Eirik, testing, probing, seeking the slightest weakness. Selene felt the pulsing warmth in her wrist flare, as if the curse itself recognized the confrontation. She clenched her fists, determined not to falter. "I will not let you control me," Selene said aloud, her voice echoing through the temple. "I am not afraid of my own blood, my own past, or you." The shadow hissed, a sound like wind across icy stones, and lunged forward. Eirik intercepted it, using his strength to push it back, but this time it did not retreat. The curse was stronger, more insistent. Selene realized that the moment of confrontation was not only about survival, it was about choice. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, reaching inward. All the fear, all the pain, all the loneliness she had carried for so long, she allowed herself to feel it, to accept it. And then she stepped forward, holding her wrist out, letting the pulse of the curse flow through her without resistance. Eirik's eyes widened, but he did not move to stop her. He only held her hand lightly, a tether of warmth and strength. "I am with you," he said simply. The shadows swirled violently, as if struggling against her newfound courage. Faces twisted in anger, longing, regret, and sorrow. Selene faced them all, speaking softly. "I forgive you. I forgive the past, the pain, the mistakes. I claim my own strength. I am no one's victim. I am whole." The pulse of the curse grew brighter, filling the temple with a cold, brilliant light. Eirik held her close, shielding her from the brunt of the energy, but allowing her to channel it. And then, in a sudden, blinding moment, the light collapsed inward and the shadows dissipated, leaving the temple silent and still. Selene gasped, her chest heaving, her body trembling. She looked down at her wrist. The mark was gone. For the first time in years, the weight that had pressed on her soul lifted. Eirik released her hand and stepped back, a faint smile on his lips. "You did it," he said softly. "You faced it all and came through stronger." Selene turned to him, tears brimming in her eyes. I could not have done it without you, she whispered. You gave me courage not by fighting for me but by standing with me. Irik's expression softened, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. In the quiet there was a sense of completion, of redemption, not just for Selene but for him as well. He had wandered through lands full of shadows, carrying guilt and regret, yet here he had found purpose and perhaps peace. The sun began to rise, faint light spilling into the temple, illuminating the runes and casting long shadows across the floor. Selene and Irik stepped outside, the snow sparkling like diamonds in the early light. The wind no longer carried a sense of menace. It was fresh, invigorating, a promise of new beginnings. They walked back to the estate slowly, side by side. Every step was lighter than the last, every glance exchanged carrying the warmth of trust and something deeper, a connection neither had named but both felt. The estate, once a place of cold walls and lingering shadows, now seemed alive with possibility. In the great hall, Selene paused and looked at Irik. The curse is gone, but I do not want to be alone anymore, she said quietly, almost afraid of the words. Irik reached for her hand again, this time holding it firmly. You will never be alone, he said, his voice unwavering. We face the world together, Lady Selene. Whatever comes next, we face it as one. Selene smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in years, she felt free to feel, to trust, to hope. And beside her, Irik stood not just as a protector, but as a companion, a confidant, and perhaps something even more. That evening they stood together on the cliffs, the sun setting over the endless northern sea. The wind whipped around them, carrying a chill that was no longer threatening but invigorating. Selene let it brush her face, feeling alive in a way she had forgotten. Irik's arm brushed hers, and he looked at her with quiet reverence. We are stronger than the darkness, he said, not because it is gone, but because we face it together. Selene nodded, feeling a thrill of certainty and hope. And even if shadows return, she said softly, we will be ready. For a long time they stood in silence, watching the waves crash against the cliffs, the snow glinting like starlight. The estate behind them seemed peaceful, almost serene, and the curse that had haunted Selene's family for generations had been broken, not by brute force, but by courage, trust, and the bond that had grown between them. As night fell, the stars emerged, scattered across the sky like distant diamonds. Selene rested her head lightly against Irik's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the thick cloak. She realized that the future, uncertain and unknown, no longer filled her with fear. She had faced the shadows, and with Irik at her side, she knew she could face anything. The wind whispered through the cliffs, carrying faint echoes of past storms, past shadows, and past fears, but they no longer held power over her. Selene and Irik had walked through darkness and come into the light together. And somewhere far off, beyond the cliffs and forests, the faintest shadow stirred, hesitant, patient, aware that its challenge had been met, but never entirely defeated. It waited, but not as a threat. It was a reminder that life, like the north wind, was wild and unpredictable. Yet Selene no longer feared it, for she knew that no matter what came, they would face it together. Irik squeezed her hand, his gaze on the distant horizon. You made me whole, he whispered. Selene smiled, her heart full, the warmth of the fire inside her matching the cold brilliance of the northern night. And we are stronger together, she said, her voice steady and certain. The northern cliffs stood silent and majestic, the snow sparkling under the starlight. And though the world beyond might bring new challenges, for this moment there was peace, hope, and the quiet promise of a shared future.